Wacken Open Air, the world's biggest heavy metal festival, where each year over 70,000 fans from around the world gather in a farm field in northern Germany to celebrate their love for heavy metal. My name is Sam Dunn, and the first time I visited Wacken for my film Metal: A Headbanger's Journey, I learned that metal is more than just music. It's a culture of outsiders, and I was blown away by the passion of metal musicians and fans. But my film was only an overview of the anthropology of heavy metal. There's a much bigger story to be told. Over the past 4 decades, heavy metal has evolved into dozens of subgenres, including thrash metal, glam metal, nu metal, prog metal, grunge, the new wave of British heavy metal, and many more. But why did metal splinter into all these subgenres? And what has each subgenre contributed to the evolution of this music?
You know, many documentaries have explored the history of jazz, classical, and the blues, but still, I feel metal has never really got its due. So this is my new journey, a journey into the evolution of heavy metal.
Journey into heavy metal's vast 40-year history is a massive undertaking. But before I delve into the entire evolution of this music, I'm gonna step back and start with the big question. Why are people drawn to heavy metal music?
It's outsider music to the max. Heavy metal solved a lot of my problems when I was a teenager, when I couldn't express myself or I was just frustrated. I would go into my room and put on a metal album and feel instant relief.
We're about excitement and power and making you angry to the point of exploding in front of everybody else. That's what metal is about.
When I bang my head, it feels good. It releases some kind of chemical inside of me. I'm not sure what it is, but heavy metal is the greatest noise that ever was created.
Heavy metal is pushing your life to the maximum, pushing it as hard as you can get it onto the edge of chaos.
It's a chance to just rail, just to get it out, to express that you're not going along with the program.
There's an aggression and an attitude and an intensity to everything I do in life, and I think it all comes from the way that music made me feel since I was a kid.
A certain kind of abandon, you know, like sort of tossing the rules out the window and just going for it. I think rock and roll in general is a great outlet, and it's really important. I think without it, we'd have a lot more violence and a lot more trouble in general with the people between, 16 and 25.
Metal is tribal. There's something tribal about being in one place, jumping up and down to the same beat, people headbanging and sweating and smacking into each other. And at the end of that concert, they've gone through something together.
Heavy metal music has become an essential catharsis. It's a rite of passage. Metal is like a celebration of community and friendship for people who simply have a genetic or emotional predisposition to gravitate towards that kind of music, that kind of aggression. The aggression is there, but it's contained, and it's controlled, and it's focused.
Meeting with these heavy metal musicians has made me realize that the power, community, and aggression in metal music connects with people on a very deep level. And so I'm curious to find out what's actually happening inside our brains when we feel aggressive from listening to heavy metal.
So I've tracked down a neuroscientist who teaches here at McMaster University, and I want to ask her, where does this feeling of aggression and power come from when we listen to metal music?
I'm
Sam. Nice to meet you.
We're interested in the auditory system here and how it develops and what the effects of experience are on the brain and how people hear things and how they react to things. And we're particularly interested in music. So when you came in, we put the sensor net on your head, and as you listen to different pieces of music, we measured your brain responses. People talk sometimes about heavy metal in terms of the violence, and the sound intensity and the distortion tends to turn off conscious thought. So you're turning off inhibition. All of us are capable of violent behavior. On the other hand, the other side of it is that we do like to feel a lack of control from time to time. And if this is done in a safe environment, then it can be a positive thing.
There's something in heavy metal music that speaks to the reptilian brain. It doesn't speak to the intellect. It doesn't speak to a thought process that's on the surface. There's something that connects very viscerally with heavy metal music that it just feels awesome.
Certainly an outlet that you couldn't get anywhere else. You come to the show and lose your mind and get in the pit and go crazy and stage dive and have fun. It's not about violence, it's about fun. You might be bruised and really tired the next day, but you know what? It's like a great massage. You're gonna feel really good afterwards.
So in the metal context, it's like you're exercising the part of you that is aggressive, that is combative, but without any real danger.
That's right.
Even though heavy metal can appear violent and aggressive to people on the outside, what I've learned is that the aggression in metal provides a positive emotional release for its musicians and fans. And so I now have a much better grasp of why people are drawn to this music. But since this series is about the evolution of metal, I need to understand how metal has changed over its 40-year history and why it's become the complex phenomenon that it is today. So I'm embarking on a journey that will take me to over 40 cities in 12 countries across 3 continents. I'll travel from the back streets of Birmingham, England to LA's Sunset Strip, and from the crossroads in Mississippi to soccer stadiums in Santiago, Chile. I'll be meeting with over 300 musicians, fans, and experts to dig deep into metal's roots and to find out why it has developed into over 24 subgenres. But to get started, I'm going back to the very beginning. What are the sonic roots of this music? Where did heavy metal actually begin? The birth of heavy metal is a much debated topic among metal fans, musicians, and experts. But most will agree that the genre was born in February 1970, when Birmingham, England's Black Sabbath released their debut record, Black Sabbath. This record was far heavier and darker than any music that had come before. So I've always wanted to ask them about their musical roots. Where did Black Sabbath get the inspiration to create this heavy sound?
Going back to that first record, how would you describe the sound that you guys were creating?
It's hard to say because it seemed to write itself. You know, we'd jam around and see what we came out with. One morning, we came out with the song Black Sabbath. It was just done in a flash. It was like Tony came up with the riff. Ozzy started singing the lyrics, and it sort of really did write itself.
were the main inspirations for that opening riff?
I remember playing Mars, the Planet Suite, on the bass when we were rehearsing, and it seemed to influence Tony to go dun dun dun, like the same sort of tritonic thing.
I think Geezer was trying to play the notes to a Holt's Mars, and Tony showed up and he lengthened the notes and he held them out. Bum, bum, bum. Sent shivers down my back. And I'm not saying that Tony took that riff from Holt's. You listen to the music and you can hear it. Very much so.
Classical music was obviously an inspiration for Black Sabbath in their early years. So I'm curious to know if classical music has been an influence on other metal musicians.
And so I've come back to Germany to meet with Uli John Roth, who's a classical music expert and former guitarist of the Scorpions, to talk with him about this connection between classical music and heavy metal.
Why have so many hard rock or heavy metal guitarists incorporated the influences of classical composers into their music? I think of Eddie Van Halen, I think of Randy Rhoads, I think of yourself and many others.
I think because it's a natural inborn desire to evolve. You know, you have this enormous reservoir and repertoire of great musicians in the past. You look at that and you can say, wow, what are these people doing? You know, maybe we can do something similar. And particularly when you're a young player, you find that exciting. You know, the dexterity angle, because you're interested in speed, you want to be fluent in what you do. And classical music teaches you that, you know.
As a young fan of metal, I thought all other music sucked. You know, like classical music, jazz music, it's totally wimpy, man. But then when I became a guitar player and I realized that the excellence of an Eddie Van Halen and Yngwie Malmsteen and the excellence of Niccolo Paganini had something in common. I appreciated not just the musicianship, but the expression that very talented non-metal musicians brought to their own genres, and it was very inspiring to me.
For some heavy metalers, classical musicians like Paganini are more than an inspiration. They're an obsession. And if Paganini were alive today and played a Fender Strat through a Marshall stack, he would be Swedish guitar virtuoso Yngwie Malmsteen.
You brought the classical sound quite boldly into the rock and metal format than what anyone else did.
What it was that I saw on TV. It was this Russian violinist who was just going mad on the violin, you know. I couldn't believe it. And they said at the end of the program, it was Niccolo Paganini's 24 Caprices. And I just said, wow, you know, if I could get any of that, you know, the linear singing notes, arpeggios, all that stuff, if you put that in the guitar, that would be amazing, you know. So once I heard that, that was it. I knew that's what I wanted to do. Just technically, it's amazing what Paganini did. And I felt that I needed to challenge myself, and I didn't want to take the easy way out. I think that's the main reason for me. I always felt like I had to be better than I am. And to me, to be better would be to play more difficult, the more complex classical type music. You know, I don't want to just play it safe. So 2-string, it'd be 3-string, 4-string, 5, 6-string arpeggios. But people kept on telling me to slow down. You know, I said, hey, slow down. I'm like, oh. You know, remember, less is more. And I always said, how can that be? How can less be more? It's impossible. More is more.
The virtuosity of classical music has been hugely inspirational for metal guitarists. But since virtuosity in heavy metal is not limited to the guitar, I've come to London, England to meet with Rob Halford, the legendary vocalist of Judas Priest, to explore how classical music has influenced his approach to metal vocal.
Before I became a professional singer, I worked in the theatre for a while, and I looked on this from the side of the stage, and I would watch opera, you know, and I'd look at the audience and I'd look at the performer and back and forth, and it was intriguing to see, and I was just mesmerised by that power of the voice and what it can do. You listen to somebody like Pavarotti, who's my ultimate god. Look at the scope that can be created by these vocal cords in your throat. It's absolutely sensational. So I've always had fun as a singer to try and do as many dramatic things as I possibly can.
Rob Halford has that ability to sort of project like an opera singer. That kind of vocal style, what does it add to metal?
Opera is a very challenging style of music to perform, you know, as a singer, especially. Much more challenging, I think, than rock music, you know. One of the things that I notice about like Rob and Bruce and myself is there's a huge amount of theatrics in our delivery, you know, trying to get your point across to the audience and affect them and elicit some sort of emotion.
Whenever I sing a song, there's always a big part of it is what I would describe as theatre of the mind. It was like applied dramatics through music. And I wouldn't like to say we were on any kind of level with any great opera or classical anything, you know. It's simply a desire to do a good job at messing with people's imagination.
Trauma and intensity, jealousy and rage and revenge, like opera. Metal's got all of those things going for it. We're about excitement and power and making you very emotional, and that's what metal is about, that whole visual, larger-than-life experience.
Heavy metal at its core is martial music. It's big, heavy, military, scare-you-to-death music. Heavy metal was a term that came much later on, but the idea of heavy music, that's been there since the beginning of time. It's the music that Wagner played in concert halls with his outsized instruments and his huge orchestras. The whole idea was shake the walls, shake the world through the power of this music.
Most musicians agree that the foundation for all rock music is the blues, which was born when Robert Johnson stood at the crossroads in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and sold his soul to the devil by choosing a life of music. But growing up, the heavy metal bands that I loved, like Iron Maiden and Metallica, seemed like the furthest thing from the blues. So what exactly is the connection between the blues and heavy metal?
So the blues and heavy metal, is there any kinship there?
I mean, how I think they're intrinsically linked. I mean, if you look at any of the British musicians, from the Stones all the way to the Yardbirds and Motorhead, all that wave of guys, they all listen to the blues.
All hard rock, metal bands started out with some sort of foundation that started with a blues riff. That's where we all started playing. Playing in a shed in my dad's garden, playing the, you know, dun 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 dun.
And have studied the blues. What's the shared DNA between early blues and modern day metal?
Well, right off the bat, they're both riff-based music. I mean, a lot of blues songs have a riff, and they just sit on that riff. Heavy metal's the same way. You sit on a riff, you just soak it for for as much emotion as you can.
The riff is a huge part of the arsenal of virtually every rock guitarist. Look at Metallica in a song like Hit the Lights. Hit the lights! Hit the lights! Hit the lights! You got riffs all over that song, but you got 3 different tempos. So you shift from one section to another, the riffs change, you get this incredible release.
Like in heavy metal, blues is also just dark in nature. They're singing about things that no one else would even touch back in those days. It had an edge to it. It wasn't glossy. The real blues of Robert Johnson and Howlin' Wolf, it sounded dark, it sounded dirty, it sounded evil. These old blues guys, they had a growl to their voice.
Oh, little bitty boy, you better tell him, don't you hear me crying?
If there's one blues vocalist who sounds like a metal frontman, it's Howlin' Wolf. So I've tracked down guitarist Hubert Sumlin, the last surviving member of Howlin' Wolf's original Mississippi Blues Band, to get a first-hand perspective on what Wolf was like.
That's it, man.
Can I ask you, how did Howlin' Wolf influence or inspire you in terms of your guitar playing?
Oh, man. Well, I tell you what, I have never seen nobody like the guy. This guy didn't have an education, but he knew about riffs, he knew about music, and he knew about feeling. He says, the thing, man, you gotta feel what you're doing.
Can you tell me about the big voice that he had?
Oh, yeah, the voice. You scared the devil out of me, man. Just like
The Howlin' Wolf name was not a joke. His voice sounds like it's coming from hell, with an animalistic sound. So there's a direct line between the heavy metal guys, who are the archetypes who really created this thing, and what you heard out of Howlin' Wolf, no doubt about it.
if you like to gamble, I tell you I'm your man. You win some, lose some, it's all the same to me.
In the tradition of what lead singers do, metal is from the blues in terms of its absolute roots. The emotional message of the blues, I think, is still relevant in metal. It's from the soul, it's very, very primordial. It's just got this kind of very gut, instinctive type of caveman-esque attitude about it.
You know I'm going to lose, and gambling's for fools, but that's the way I like it, baby. I don't want to live forever.
The blues clearly has some strong musical connections with heavy metal. But there's still one more genre in the prehistory of metal that I want to explore, and that's jazz.
But I gotta say, I never considered jazz and metal to have anything in common. So is jazz an influence on heavy metal musicians?
A lot of jazz is and it sounds like what it is, like poorly thought out masturbation by guys that can, so it has a bad reputation for that. But there are certain guys within it that have just been astonishing.
Was jazz an influence?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Growing up, we had a huge collection of American records, and every Saturday night, my dad would sing to them, and my mum would play a little bit of piano, and I listened to all those songs. There was a song by Glenn Miller. It diminished, and then suddenly it would boom, 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 boom. In the Mood, I think it was, and I loved it. So I was terribly influenced by that music.
And did you take that and try to bring that to Sabbath's music?
Oh, it's in Sabbath's music. You can hear all the swing in there. You can hear it in Fairies. Ba-bam, bam, ba-dum, ba. When you're doing those kind of chops, it's swing. And the band could swing real well.
was a jazz drummer. If you listen to the stuff he's doing on the drums, it's not, you know, it's not thud, whack, crash. It's all really jazzy. And Iommi was a very jazzy player, as is Geezer Butler. So this really heavy band, but with a bit of a jazzy feel to it, more or less invented heavy metal.
Why are so many metal musicians influenced by
Because those were the masters of their instrument, really. You know, you would take stuff that they did and rockify it to use the way you want to use it. I mean, rock drumming is an art form. It's like jazz drumming is an art form. Buddy Rich was a God-gifted animal. He was very vicious in his playing, very aggressive. He was a drum star, a drum hero, an icon.
I saw on TV Buddy Rich, I remember at a very young age, and I was amazed at his energy, you know, and how he played, you know, the velocity that he would hit the drums. The drums dominate the moment.
He was thrash before thrash was ever thrash. If you watch some of his soloing, how fast his hands are going, what he's doing, I mean, probably not a better drummer than him ever to have touched a drum set. And so getting into heavy metal, I was like, that's for me, because I want to do something different. It was exciting. That pushed my drumming to another level.
Whether it's jazz, blues, or classical, I now have a much better understanding of metal's deepest musical roots. But all these genres are missing one of the most important elements of heavy metal, the sound of the distorted electric guitar. So what are the roots of metal's electrified sound?
Just one quick reminder, you must remain seated throughout the rest of the flight. Thank you.
You women have heard of jalopies, you've heard the noise they make, but let me introduce my new Rocket 88. Yes, it's straight, just one way. Everybody likes my Rocket 88. Baby, we'll ride in style, moving all along.
Classical, jazz, and the blues all help lay the foundation for heavy metal. But probably the most obvious musical antecedent of metal is rock and roll. And so I've come to Sun Studios in Memphis, Tennessee, the home of rock music, to find out what were the specific musical elements of rock that later became essential components of the heavy metal sound. Why is Sun Studio the birthplace of rock and roll?
Well, it all stems from a particular recording that took place here back in 1951, Rocket 88, by a band by the name of Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. And I've got the absolute very first copy that was ever recorded down here on Sam Phillips' lathe recorder.
Sam Phillips, you know, producer at Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee, is incredibly important in the history of American music, period. Sam wanted things that sounded different. That was always his goal. He's the guy that when, you know, Ike Turner arrives at the Sun Studio in 51 to cut Rocket 88, and the speaker cone is cracked and consequently has this distorted sound, he's the one who goes, that's incredible, I want that sound.
As the story goes, the guitarist, Willie Kizzert, was taking his amp out of the car and putting it up on top of the car. Amp fell off the back, punched a hole in the speaker cone. So they went inside, they stuffed it full of newspaper. Sam loved the sound of the punctured speaker cone of the amplifier itself. And it was, according to most music historians, the first recorded use of distorted electric guitar in music in general.
Besides the distorted electric guitar, another contribution of 50s music to the development of heavy metal was the arrival of the wild rock and roll frontman.
Come on over, baby. Oh, let me shake it on. Yeah. Come on over, baby. Baby, you can't go wrong. Honey, I ain't faking. Oh, let me shake it on.
When I first heard Jerry Lee doing a whole lot of shaking going on, by God, I wanted to sound like that. There was a kind of raw animal, untextured, untutored feel to it all. And that, to me, as a very textured, tutored young man who you know, been poring over Beethoven, Bach, and the like. This was massively exciting.
I think that's one thing you get from the rock and roll guys, you know, from that era. It's America during a time when there's a Red Scare going on. There's a lot of fear. The communists are going to get us. You know, the bomb is going to blow us all up. And these guys represented a kind of wildness and freedom that was not expressed in any other really forms of the popular culture.
The heaviest thing when I was growing up was Little Richard. He didn't like try and make his voice nice, you know, acceptable. He just sang it how he felt it, you know. And I always admired that. That's why I sing like I do, you know. I don't try and put in any special airs and graces. Like, you know, what you see is what you get.
So there's a connection from Little Richard to Lemmy.
Yeah, a big one, you know. Because if I had a hero in those days, it would have been him.
Little Richard, you know, you listen to Tutti Frutti, his first big hit in '55, and it's like, it's transgressive in all sorts of ways. He is shredding his larynx in those 2 bars, and the sound just leaps out of those speakers.
She knows how to love me, yes indeed. Boy, you don't know what you do to me.
I want to go back to another early rock and roller. What was Elvis's contribution to this story?
Elvis was the Metallica of his time. Elvis took rock and roll out of its small fan base and made it safe for the rest of America. Elvis sold rock and roll. Without Elvis, I don't know what would have happened to rock and roll.
Elvis to me was balls to the wall, you know, and he was incredibly influential. I didn't want to do anything else other than get a job like Elvis. You know, in Great Britain, we were used to safe listening. So when Elvis comes up shaking his ass and, you know, saying, wasn't through a party in the county jail, the prison band was there, and he began to wail, you know, it's just like, whoa.
Went to a party at the county jail. You know, if you listen to that and then just transpose it to Saturday night and I just got paid, gonna fool around, ain't gonna save. I mean, it's Elvis. So jailhouse rock and things like that, you just transpose them and put some metal to it, and all of a sudden it becomes kind of a blues-based medley type thing.
Before iconic heavy metal bands like Deep Purple emerged onto the scene, in the early 1960s, rock and roll went through a phase that felt like the furthest thing from heavy metal.
Elvis joined the army. Little Richard went religious. Buddy Holly died. What was the state of rock at that time?
Rock and roll was scary and creepy. Elvis had gone into the army. Everybody else was in prison. Suddenly, Frankie Avalon showed up singing Venus, if you will. Please send a little girl for me to thrill.
Venus, if you will. Please send a little girl for me to thrill. A girl who wants my kisses and my arms. A girl with all the charms of you.
So I guess music in America had become fairly safe.
Very safe and very manufactured. Sometimes we're not even sure that that particular artist sang that song. They had a certain look to them, an Eastern slick-back look. The songs were very simple. The songs were about teddy bears and falling in love with your girlfriend and simple things.
So there was a lot of fake rock and roll. People were faking the funk, so to speak. And there's a space. There's kind of a sudden emptiness where there's a, what's the new excitement going to be in the culture?
Make my wish come true.
In the early 60s, rock and roll crossed the Atlantic from America to Britain, kicking off what is famously known as the British Invasion. And if there's one band from this invasion that's part of the story of heavy metal, it's the Kinks, and the groundbreaking sound on their song, You Really Got Me.
What was your inspiration for the guitar sound on the first Kinks record?
Well, we had that sound like 6 months before we recorded, before You Really Got Me was around. I used to experiment with the guitar, but the guitar sounds are very limited. of just tone control and volume. That was about it. And I came across this little amp in the shop up the road, and it was called an El Pico. And I just got a razor blade and started to cut the cone of the speaker. I don't know why. And I plugged it in, and it made that amazing sound.
You really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing.
And so I'm still only three-fingered chords on my guitar, and now I've got this really gritty, twangy, woody sound in my amp with the speaker slashed. So this chord now sounds immense. It was like discovering something. Felt more like an inventor than a musician.
You really got me. You really got me. You really got me.
The first dirty guitar I'd ever heard was You Really Got Me. That very early da-da-da-da-da was so, like, demonic. Made mums and dads go, oh, turn it off, it's evil.
You Really Got Me. It's about grit, it's about raw expression and feeling. It's not about whining and dining or middle-class behaviour. It's about, I like you, I want to you.
In the early 60s, when the scene in England was on the upswing, the clubs were getting bigger, the crowds were getting bigger, and it was also getting louder. The environment was louder, and the musicians wanted to be heard. Give me something I want to keep that sound, but I just want it louder.
The whole aesthetic of loud. I mean, if, you know, who would you cite as the most important precursor of metal? I would cite Jim Marshall, who developed the Marshall amps to make for loudness.
As rock music developed in the 60s, musicians started to play in larger venues, and so they needed technology and equipment to fill those venues. And there's no name that's more associated with heaviness and volume than Marshall. So we've come to the factory here in England to find out why it is that Marshall became the amplifier that was iconic of heavy metal music. I've also heard they've got an amp that goes up to 11, and that's just something I have to see. Can you tell me how Marshall amps got started?
Dad, long before he dreamed of making an amplifier, his passion was drumming, so he started a drum shop. And from that, a lot of the bands would come in, a lot of the drummers would come in, and they'd bring the guitarists in, and the young lad came in, local lad, Pete Townsend, because he used to hang around in the shop. And they used to talk about the Fender Bassman, and it wasn't quite giving Pete quite the sound he wanted. So Dad set about changing it, really, and I think they built 4 or 5 prototypes in the early days in '62. They finally built one. Pete Townsend said, that's a great sound, and off he went to use it. So, yeah, that's how it started.
People try to put us down just because we can get around. My generation, things they do look awful. Talking about my generation, if I die before I get old. Talking about my generation.
Jim Marshall basically took the Fender amp and the Vox AC30, and he created a new animal, a Marshall, 100 watts, which was unheard of. It was a beast, basically.
Originally, his stack was all one piece, you know. And, like, it was murder to carry about, and there was no van in the world that you could fit it into.
Dad said to Pete that, at the time, that this is just going to be too heavy. And Pete said to him, well, it's okay, I've got roadies now. So he built this 8x12 cabinets. We built 12 of them, and I think it was a couple of months later, Pete came back in and said, these are too heavy. And that's when he actually built the first stack. So he built the 4x12 bottom cab and the angled cab.
They sawed it in half, and that's when you got the stack as it is now, you know.
Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't really have metal or hard rock without that invention, I guess.
No, that's right. Townsend did you a great service.
When The Who came on with these first Marshall stacks anybody had ever seen, whoa, you were pinned back with the sheer power of it. I mean, physical air moving, and it was shocking and dazzling and fantastic. And of course, that started the revolution, you know. The next band had to be just as loud, or louder.
Backed by Marshall stacks, The Who set in motion a volume race, and bands were now competing to be the loudest in all of Britain. But then there was one musician from America who would expand the sound of rock guitar beyond just volume and distortion.
What was it that Hendrix did that pushed that concept of heaviness in music?
What Hendrix did was expand the musical horizon of the electric guitar to the degree that no one else has. The greatest innovative sounds, the playing, stretching the boundaries. You know, when he broke on the scene in '66, people are going, wow, we've never heard anything like this. It was like wildfire. The message spread, hey, you got to come check out this guy, Jimi Hendrix. He's incredible. He plays left-handed, and it's upside down, and he does stuff with his teeth and behind his head. You've never seen anything like it. You've never heard anything like it.
When Hendrix came, forget about it. It was just a whole nother world. And then everything got very electric and very distorted, and people tried to push the levels even farther because now they had the fuzz tones. All these sounds that they were developing in the studio, they now made gizmos you could take on the road with you, plug them in, and all of a sudden you could be the most distorted guitar player in the world.
It's an interesting question why distortion became desirable in music. I remember the first time that I bought a big muff distortion pedal. Until then, I'd been playing these horrible sort of tinkling, jangling things. And as soon as I stepped on that thing, it was rock and roll. I mean, like, it was instantly rock and roll music. And that, I think, is something, too, that I don't think there's a way to intellectualize it. There's something deep in the DNA that responds to the sound of an overridden amplifier. All of a sudden, the world is a little bit more exciting.
Just turning up the volume and getting some distortion through the amps, through the guitars. It's all kind of little embryos of sound, and other musicians are picking it up and thinking, well, if I take a bit of that guitar distortion and put that with a big bass drum sound, put a thundering bass guitar and a screaming vocal, what is that going to sound like? Well, to me, it's going to sound like a heavy metal band's beginning.
So far is that the origins of metal are way more complex than I first thought. People have been creating bombastic sounds that channel feelings of rebellion and aggression for hundreds of years. And so on a conceptual level, metal isn't new at all. But I think what surprises me most is that the sense of community that I feel in metal and at places like Wacken isn't new either. Ever since Elvis gyrated his hips or Little Richard screamed into the microphone, music has provided young people with a community to belong to. And so ultimately, what I feel I'm faced with in this series is the realization that metal and us metalheads are part of a much bigger story than I ever could have imagined.